Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Into the Bytecode. Today I sat down with Phillip, Wang, and Nate Foss, two of the co-founders of Gather. Gather is a video chat platform that puts you and the people you're communicating with in a virtual space and gives you the ability to move around and interact with them based on your locations in that space, just like in real life. It's had a ton of traction over the last year and is being used by millions of people around the world. I think it's one of the coolest products I've personally used in recent memory. Beyond having built a product that's unlocking new behavior, the reason I find Gather interesting is that the team is deeply aligned with the Web3 ethos and philosophy. They plan to build Gather into a progressively open and decentralized system. So in this conversation, we spent a lot of time going deep on what this could actually look like. We talk about how Gather is architects under the hood and how they think about decentralizing the game engine and the tech stack. We talk about identity, how login and the social graphs between different people might work in this world. We talk about business models, and we talk about how Phillip has been inspired by Ethereum and how he's thinking about where Gather goes from here. We also talk about the metaverse and the path dependence of how this future unfolds. We actually recorded this conversation the day after Facebook announced their new name and vision with Meta. And so we also touched on that. Phillip and Nate are two incredibly thoughtful and mission-oriented people. They have a vision for the future, and it was really cool to talk with them about this. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the conversation. Let's start with the basics. Could you explain what Gather is to people who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah. So Gather, long story short, is building towards the metaverse. We're starting with this app that's kind of like a cross between Pokemon and Zoom, where it's like you're in this 2D environment, you have this character, and then you see and hear the people near you, right? And so it's a primitive that you often do in real life, where you might have multiple people in the same space and walking in and out of conversations. But more than that, like it kind of is just a way for people to get together in all these different contexts. So it's kind of hard to explain without seeing it firsthand, but just to give context, like for example, our whole team, 70 people across 12 countries, like works in this virtual office where everyone will have a desk and you kind of come in the morning. And then if you ever need anyone, you can like walk up to them, right? Or you might bump into people in the hallways, or you'll see people create event venues where you create like all the talks and all the sponsor booths and all the hallways. And then you'll even see all sorts of other creation of like wedding venues and people getting married and gather. So just to give a picture, it's just a very kind of general purpose first take on the metaverse, focusing on like, what can you build today?
Yeah, I really think it's one of these products that the very first time you use it, it definitely gave me personally a sense of this is different. And just seeing these 2D avatars that you can move with your arrow keys across the screen. And we've actually been just like right before our call, I was in a Gather space, which is kind of cool. So we're doing this sprint until the end of the year with a group of teams that are building early stage Ethereum projects. And I've been kind of grappling with how do you best coordinate, with a group of 20 people so they can, come in and like have conversations and get together around, different topics. And Gather just seems more and more, the more I'm becoming familiar with the tool and the map maker and all of this stuff, I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah. I think one thing that's always so awesome is when people kind of come in for the first time and at first they're like, what is this? And then they first see someone kind of walk up to them. They're like, whoa. And then they get like a serendipitous interaction where like they bump into someone in like a hallway. That's when there's like just a ton of joy and they like really get it. So glad y'all are using it too.
Yeah. So how does that work with your office? Do 70 people show up to the Gather space and you have kind of private spaces for different people, or?
Yeah, basically. So like everyone has their own desk and we have all these settings so that, for example, you're kind of like working there all the time. And if you're not looking straight at the tab, it will like mute your own audio and video. But someone can still kind of like walk up to you. You might hear some ambient noise in the morning, or someone might just like say good morning. Your desk mate just might say good morning to you. And then we use it for everything you would normally do. Yeah,
We call that GM in this world.
exactly. Exactly. And we kind of do everything you would normally do in a real life office there. So we do all our meetings in there. We have like social rooms in there, like an all hands room. And basically we still use Slack just to give it a sense for like how it gets used. We still use Slack. We use it in the same way that you'd normally do that in a real life office. Right. So you might like message people, but if you want to just like walk up to their desk, you just do that. Or if you want to like play poker, we have tables where you can do that, etc. So there's not really exactly one exact use case for it.
Yeah, super cool. So you started by saying Gather is building towards the metaverse. And I'm curious, because I've heard you briefly talk about this before, and either of you feel free to jump in here. Like how did you come to land on this product as the first step to on this like longer path? Like why this
Yeah.
instantiation of it?
Yeah. Actually, maybe I could first start by like talking about what we mean by the metaverse. Because I think increasingly over the past like 6 months or so, like it's gone to mean anything from like just NFTs generically to these VR worlds and whatnot.
And since yesterday also, which
And
we'll
since yesterday, yeah.
we'll get into as well.
Yeah, so what the metaverse means to us is kind of like this virtual layer over the physical world that's about like how people connect with each other. And we see people in the future connecting across all these different use cases, things that are kind of like not just a game. For example, our team is actually working out of here, right? Or we've seen people in the past year like actually go to class in here or interact with their communities or their friends or their family. And the reason to build this is to create this opportunity and connection for people no matter where they are, right? Traditionally, you would kind of live 30 minutes from where you work, and that determines so much in terms of what family did you have to move away from, or which friends do you stay close with, or what lifestyle you have. And, even for some people who can't move in the first place, they wouldn't have these opportunities. So that's kind of really why we're building the metaverse. Kind of how we got here was a long story. Basically, me and one of our other co-founders had been working for a whole year before the pandemic on like the social version of this. Like, how do you stay close to their, close friends and family, no matter where they are? And our conviction had initially came from like VR, and we got really excited about it. And that's where the metaverse all started coming together in our heads. I remember I was talking to Nate about this. We found that after like a year of not talking, we both converged on like the metaverse is the next most interesting thing to work on. And I was like, I'm ready to like strap down and work on this for 5 years, wait for the headsets to get better. And then when the pandemic happened, I was like, oh, there's a version of this that can start being useful today. Right. And you can already start solving a lot of the metaverse problems that are not just like around VR, but like, how do you interact with these worlds? Right. How do you interact with each other? And how does this show up in real life? And so that's kind of like where we start with Gather. And obviously like Nate was a really great person that I wanted to bring in. And then we had another co-founder, Alex, who has also been super instrumental since then.
Nate, how did you get involved? Because I read that you were working on a decentralized social network project for a long time before.
There were sort of two different like really big projects that I was excited about. One was the social network and one was the metaverse. And the metaverse was a lot bigger and harder. So I was working on the social network, mostly by myself, just like, as over the summer and during the semester at school. But then when Phillip called me up and it was clear that there was like a team forming around the metaverse, that definitely seemed like it was the opportune time to like actually go for it and build it. Because the team is everything.
Yeah. I remember I really had to convince Nate to like pause his work on the decentralized social network to come join. But also what I also remember is at least a few months before we actually started Gather, where we were kind of like reconnecting, I had some slight inclination, like some slight inklings of, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but like why the metaverse should look more decentralized. I hadn't actually read too much about any like blockchain stuff. I vaguely knew about it, but I had like the intuition that, it should look like a lot more like the web, right? Where you have like Chrome extensions and like innovation at every layer of the stack. And then when I talked to Nate, he kind of like sent me his blog post about why decentralized social networks are kind of like really important. And I was like, oh, this person like
Just
understands this a lot more
melt.
than I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we jump into all the decentralization stuff, Philip, you mentioned even before the VR stuff is ready, there are all these kind of patterns of interaction and design patterns and things to figure out. Like, what are some of the things you've had to grapple with? Like some of the unknowns, some of the new territory that you've opened up and you're like, we don't know what this should look and feel like. And then you've had to think through that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so one of the things that I was always saying kind of when we were starting with the metaverse or just thinking about it in general was like the metaverse, what it's bottlenecked by is like social acceptance, right? If we actually want to have this world that impacts the world all the ways that I say, it's like, how do you actually create a world that like you can actually work out of, right? And how does that show up in people's lives? What are the exact like value adds that you're going to do? Then you go beyond that, right? Let's say like you walk out of our office and it goes to the broader city, right? And maybe there's Ethereum's office in there. We have a lot of crypto startups who have offices. And what if you put them all together in this town, right? And that's a community space. It's kind of like the virtual Silicon Valley, except, you know, in the metaverse, if you will. And then there's all sorts of questions there in terms of like, how do people decide, right? Like whose office goes where, right? What are the access controls? Who determines, you know, what the policies are going to be? So there's all of these sorts of questions. And then even beyond that, there's a whole other layer on like, maybe what are the side layers of the metaverse in terms of identity, in terms of like, oh, I want to know if one of my other friends is kind of like around in the metaverse and open for me to kind of drop by. Like, and then there's a whole other thing on like creation and like how that works. So to us, kind of like metaverse never meant exactly like VR immersive worlds. It more meant how do people interact with each other and these spaces we create. And that is something that you can already start defining without VR.
I'm curious. So yeah, you talk about leaving the Gather office and walking into the city, and there's metaverse, I guess, is such a broad word, and more it's being taken for different visions of the future. I'm curious if you fast forward, 5 years or 10 years into the future, what kind of a world are we living in, and how do the physical and the virtual meld together in that world?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to remember is that it's hard to exactly understand the timescales at which this works at. You know, like Gather has actually only existed for like a year and a half, and it's been a crazy wild ride. But generally, I think to the question of like physical versus virtual, our belief is also that people generally think of like the real world versus, the metaverse. And I think that's the wrong framing. It's more like the metaverse will integrate very closely with the physical world, and they shouldn't be thought of as separate. And I think there's even some design choices already made today where it's like there have been virtual worlds in the past, like Second Life or some of these like games that I actually grew up on playing, that where the point was kind of that you had a separate identity. And here it's not really, right? Like our office, everyone's kind of showing up as themselves, specifically kind of like, I am here to work in this context. And so that's like one way that it shows up. I think in the future, we really want to see a world where it's not as if like everyone is all interacting only through the metaverse, right? It's like for the people that I can see in person, maybe socially, I'll do that. But for the people where that's not an option, that's what the metaverse is for. And hopefully, eventually, you can actually get the two to blend, right? Like we hang out in real life, people who can't be there physically, like beam in through the metaverse, and same across like all the use cases as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think we're getting an inkling of this in the crypto world too, with the social interactions that open up, when you're a community rallying around the particular NFT, like however frivolous that might be, it's just bringing together a whole bunch of people who are having fun, who are connecting, like who are all under their different pseudonyms. And it's something that you couldn't recreate the same thing in the real world, or it's an addition to what's possible in the real world. It's opening up like new space of possibilities.
Right. It's so interesting how community is so key to crypto.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Gather has resonated a decent amount in the crypto community, is because it's like, this is kind of like the medium that's easier for them too.
Yeah, I'm curious, like how are people in the crypto world using Gather? Have people discovered it? It still feels like I've seen people talk about it, but it still feels a bit under the radar.
Yeah. I honestly feel like, and we'll talk about this more when Nate some of the stuff that Nate is working on with opening up, making the world's fully programmable and everything, you'll see like a next layer of kind of
Oh
use
man.
cases. Today, what it looks like is there's a lot of crypto companies who use it as their office. Sometimes they'll use it for like events that they're hosting. And then some of the more like interesting, but kind of like newer use cases, like for example, there's one of the public spaces is called like Crypto Arcade.
Oh yeah, I went in there this morning.
Cool. Yeah. So they put a bunch of NFTs around there, and like there's people from the community just using it as a space to hang out, and they have like arcade games in there as well. There's some other ones like crypto communities in like Southeast Asia who also have similar spaces, and it's just again a community space.
Right. Yeah. So far, I mean, a bunch of people have just been using it like for what Gather is good for. Like nothing crypto specific. It's just like, oh, you need a place to like meet up with some people and like, have higher fidelity, person to person interactions than just like over text or Twitter or whatever else, right? But there are a couple of teams that we've been working with as we like open up the API and make Gather more programmable, that are working on things that are like really actually more crypto native. So not just gating a space based on like DAO membership or something like that, like controlling access to a Gather space based on some crypto primitives, but even stuff like controlling what your outfit can be in Gather based on whether you own like what loot and stuff like that. And so like, yeah, so this is all in the works. And like the coolest part about this is that we're not even building it, right? Like we're deliberately enabling this kind of stuff, but by just like trying to open up the Gather system more and more, other people have shown tons of willingness to like build all of this cool stuff on top of it. And like we're really happy to be enabled.
Well, I know you guys are thinking about things in a decentralized way. So I'm curious, like how is all of this architected under the hood? Like when you're making Gather programmable, what's actually happening under the hood there?
This is like one of the reasons why I was really, really, really trying to get Nate. I was like, we need someone who understands decentralization because this is going to be important for the metaverse. And I remember in the beginning, we had a ton of conversations around like, do we start decentralized, or like, how do we make sure that we can get there? So again, we really believe it's really important in terms of like, how do people probably innovate on it? How do you get the best version where there isn't one person who owns too much of it, but rather like the whole thing evolves on its own. But our philosophy has kind of been like, we start centralized in many ways because we're not yet sure on like the abstractions yet. And then like progressively, as we become more sure of it, it becomes decentralized, and they can go more into like how that actually looks like.
Yeah, totally. So like the first sort of system to open up, and one that's like, I think we've found the correct sort of structure for, is the backend and like the sort of game logic, making the game logic programmable. So like concretely, how you would interact with the Gather API right now is there's an SDK. You connect to like the game server over WebSockets, and you can like subscribe to all of the game events and send actions back. I mean, you have to be an owner of the space. It can't just be anyone changing the map data. But basically, you get the whole flood of like everything that happens in game. You can react to in whatever way you want. Just write whatever code you want and send basically arbitrary state changes back. So you can have something like, if like this person tries to like walk into this other room, but they don't have any loot, or they haven't like linked their Ethereum address or something yet, then you like teleport them back to the lobby until they have some loot, and then you can like also put them in an outfit corresponding to their loot and stuff like that. And this is like all programmable, right? We don't have to enable any specific thing. We just sort of like open up this API to say, here are all of the like game events that you can listen to, and here are all of the like different things that you can do in response to that. And people can just run, arbitrary code on their side and control it that way. And that this is just the first step, right? Like, so obviously, letting people do arbitrary stuff server side and like change around the map data and stuff like that is like an important component. But that's like, only a small fraction of it, right? Like future stuff is, we want people to be able to like control the UI more, not just sort of what the map looks like and, what outfits people are wearing or whatever their status is or something like that, but even the interface itself, and like make sort of more complex interactions with the space and interactions with each other. One thing that like Phillip has wanted forever is like to be able to implement Pokemon and gather and have like cutscenes where you're like battling Pokemon with each other and stuff like that. And so like this is, the next phase of where we open up. And yeah, the plan is kind of to just, as we figure out what the sort of correct abstractions are and like how these systems should approximately be separated, we'll just like separate them out one at a time, let other people swap in whatever they want if they don't want to use our like, default logic or default UI or whatever else. And eventually we end up with a system where like we're a good option for your metaverse browser or your metaverse UI or your metaverse hosting or whatever, but you're not like tied to Gather in any way. And like if someone invents a new thing that's better than what we do, then it'll replace us. And like
Super
that's
interesting.
correct.
I think I some other examples of like different layers of the stack. We're basically like trying to do this at every layer of the stack. One is like even our map creation tools. The ones that we use ourselves are all open to people, but also the API that people use is open. And so we've actually seen people create their own versions of our map maker. Like some of the businesses
Oh, no
that are built on
way.
top of Gather.
There
Yeah,
are
like,
alternative map makers.
yeah, they're like specialized for their use case right now. But it's like, for example, there's a conference management company that has gone like started on Gather, right? And they do very specific things when it comes down to like setting up posters in a conference room correctly, or like
They
doing
have
all this
like
other stuff.
macros or scripts that they run.
Exactly, yeah. And so like they have like, if you just give me 150 posters and I'll figure out how to set them all right, how to put your talks in the right place. And that's like exactly what we want to see. Another thing we've done like internally is like we have many different use cases. And I think the right long-term organization here, like there are different websites on the metaverse, right? And so what we've done internally is kind of like our remote work use case is one of the big ones. Events is another big use case. They're actually separate in code. And it forces the underlying platform beneath all of it to like build in the right way so that in the future, there could be like a third party use case, like education. Someone else builds that in the same way our current like remote work team builds all like the features specific for remote work.
How are these use cases different in terms of how they're using the platform? Is it not the same objects and the same game logic at play?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of the same underlying core components, but the reason that we split in the first place is because we found that they were like differing in pretty interesting ways. And so like one like really core way in which remote work is different from events is just like a lot of remote work is actually passive presence. And so like thinking about something as basic as just who you're connected to and how like loud they are and how close they are and stuff like that. This is like, you want a totally different system when you're just sort of sitting around in your office and like, maybe you want some like ambient background conversation to be audible so that, you can walk over to someone's desk if they're talking about something that you're interested in, or you can just like ignore people and, stay focused. Whereas events, like it's so important to have like natural flow between different conversations where like, I mean, Zoom breakout rooms are like, one extreme, right? Where you like are all the way into one conversation only or all the way into another conversation only. And so, one of the things that we've been thinking about and that the events team now probably thinks a lot about is like how you blend that more naturally. So like in real life, you could have a much more flowing thing where, some conversations like maybe like, a little boring or is going off track or something. And then you hear something from the other side of the room where somebody's talking about Ethereum and you're like, oh, like maybe I'll go over there.
Yeah.
And you can just sort of like migrate between bubbles more naturally. And it's not just this like all in or all out kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's like way more important, right? For like social and synchronous things than like work where you're like deliberately talking to someone in a meeting or you're like not, or it's
one of the
something
things
like
that I like, one of the moments where I was like, whoa, I had another moment of realization when it came to Gather was when I saw how you could have tables and like the conversation is scoped to the people who are sitting around the table together, even if they're in the same space. And that just allows you to move in and out in a much more seamless way. But then there's a whole other layer of complexity that you have in the real world, which is you could be sitting at a dinner table with 6 people and you could literally choose to focus your attention on this conversation or on that conversation, and it happens.
Right.
And we take these sorts of things for granted, but like to recreate that in the virtual world seems incredibly complicated.
Yeah. And actually kind of like philosophically to this point, this is kind of the right way to figure out where the boundary lies between like platform and like website, I guess, where it's like we've architected it so that, there's these different use cases with all these different needs, like, and different, as Nate mentioned, like different considerations. And over time, as these people develop, they'll start to learn like, oh, actually, we need this parts to be able to be differentiated between use cases. Right. And so
Yeah.
like, I think the answer to your question was like, we don't know exactly how they're going to be different, but this is how we figure out.
You give them that extra degree of freedom and see how they differ from each other.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It's like they have slightly different like physics, like rules of the
Exactly.
game, like how your voice carries or something is different. Going back to this question around the architecture, so to make sure I understand, there's this game engine that's progressing. It's kind of keeping the physics of this virtual world together. People can walk around, their voice carries, their videos like open and close. And this stream of events is opened up to a developer through like a WebSocket API, and you can subscribe to that. And level one right now is that you can kind of have these callbacks that change things on the map, right? Or you can run any server-side code that you want on your side. So you could check if this user, if their ETH address holds a particular NFT or like something like that. And then you could use that to allow them to enter a room or not, or to make their character transform in a certain way.
Yeah, totally. And you could do just as much to the maps and stuff like that. So, you could have a dungeon where like when everybody has like walked into the next stage, there's like some rocks fall behind you and like close off the doorway or something, and you have to like keep going and exploring this dungeon or whatever else, right? Or like, something more remote worky would be like, we could have something where when All Hands is about to start every day, we could like put confetti around the map or something and be like, and even play a sound, right? Like, it's all hands time, whatever, or something like that.
Yeah.
You could have, it's really
That's so
pretty
cool.
limited.
So I guess if I'm taking like the fully decentralized lens on this, right, it would be, where is the game engine living, right? And the fully decentralized version of it would be that the game engine is hosted on some decentralized network, right? And that's what ultimately structurally allows anyone to permissionlessly write to it and, not allow a platform to gate people in and out. So but that's obviously like a very complicated thing, right? Like if you're thinking about this decentralized over time type of progression, like how do you think about that? Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways that you could like fully decentralize the sort of backend game engine. In the limit, like it should just definitely be possible to have a totally peer-to-peer system, right? Like we shouldn't bake into the system that there must be a game server or something like that, right? Like there should be some way to run client-side code. So like I love that IPFS has a JavaScript implementation, right? So you can just like have no backend at all and stuff like that, right? This is great. And so like that should be possible. At the same time, we actually started out peer-to-peer for video, not for the game state itself, but for video. And peer-to-peer like doesn't scale very well in a lot of cases. And so there needs to be like some other way to have like a really like low latency, high throughput kind of system. And actually like having a central server where each person has a single connection to this one server and it just sort of synchronizes everything really fast. It's going to be hard to beat that peer-to-peer, but you can still do this in a decentralized way where like if the server is untrusted and maybe like has to attach proofs that like the state update that it's doing is legal,
Totally.
then it's totally fine, right? And if the server is like swappable, right? Like if the server's, there's nothing special about it. It's just sort of doing the job for you. But you could swap it out with another one if it starts to misbehave or something like that, or if it like fails one of the validations, then that's like pretty decentralized, right? And this is like probably the best of both worlds where like you can have, in the good case where someone's behaving, you just get the super fast benefits of like some centralized server, but you don't have to trust them. You just verify that what they're doing is, correct. And then in the bad case where they're misbehaving, you can swap them out and, then the network pauses or the space pauses for like a half second while, you switch to a different host.
Yeah, it's not feasible to run a game engine that's like having ticks updated like hundreds of times a second
Right.
on like some sort of a super decentralized blockchain. But I guess what I'm taking away from what you're saying is like there are systems like crypto in general is not going to work in that way in the future too, right? You can't have billions of users interacting with websites all on a decentralized network like Ethereum. Like most of the interactions are going to move to like layer twos where the operator is posting proofs that they did the work correctly, and all of the users have a baked-in right to exit. And this, like, it game theoretically keeps the system safe and sound, and like it allows for other parties to spin up. But ultimately, like it is like a server or multiple servers that are processing the transactions.
Yeah, for sure. And like this is already kind of the architect, like almost the architecture that we're in, right? Like it's the case that the core gather game engine sort of enforces the like physics of the game and enforces that, only editors are allowed to change the map data and like permissions like that. But you're just trusting us. Like tons and tons of people could be writing these like gather mods, like that third party logic that, do all kinds of wacky stuff. And you don't have to trust them, right? Like you can enter any space and that, and you can have any, sort of extension to your space like that you add on that some other person's untrusted code or whatever. And that because like it's the gather core engine that's enforcing it, like, only editors can edit the map still. You can imagine a world in which now with every game event, like the server attaches a proof that it did it honestly. This would be kind of expensive to verify on the client side. So you maybe want to do some sort of like compression or roll up or something. But, the server could just attach proofs to things that say like, oh yeah, the person who like did this action
Right.
is indeed an editor. Here's a witness. And then you don't even trust our servers, right? And that's like,
Yeah.
that's
I
pretty
think
cool.
what I was, Phillip, when like you and I got to hang out, in Seattle, like one thing I was really surprised by was how seriously you are taking these sorts of ideas, right? Like you are thinking about Gather as an eventually like decentralized type project. And like, I mean, just the stuff we're talking about, is this the direction you see the project going in?
Yeah. So I guess just to give some context on like where we came from at all, like there was actually never any real intention to build a company when we started out. All we wanted to do was build this idea of the metaverse. And in fact, we had some reasons to believe it should not be a company, right? Like the closest analogy we had to the metaverse was the internet, which kind of like we got lucky that it started with all these like open protocols and all these people kind of like building it just for the goodness of their hearts. And like it explicitly was not one company. It was a bunch of like volunteers and kind of the governments funded a lot of the research. And so in the beginning, we were just kind of like, well, we want to push for the metaverse the best we can. Like maybe this should actually be like a nonprofit or like an open source collective. And that's kind of like where we started. And I think over time, what we realized like was like, okay, actually we need a lot of resources to build this. And the part that we're missing today is not like the lowest layers and like the protocols, but rather kind of like the higher level of the stack, like what will people actually use first.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like our intentions still remain the same. We just want to build kind of like the best metaverse. To us, that means like definitely many aspects of decentralization, many aspects of like other people being able to innovate and less like platform lock-in or like less kind of like closed protocols that other people can't really have any say in. So yeah, definitely over time, this is definitely the vision. We want to push this forward. The way that I think our approach kind of looks like higher level is like, again, we are focusing on like the higher and the middle layers of the stack, where high is kind of like, what are the websites people will use if we're using the internet analogy, right? And the middle layer is kind of like, what are these game server abstractions? What are these map creator tools? What do they all look like? And then really looking at like, what is the lowest layer? So that's actually why, for example, Gather has been trying to like figure out how they can contribute to some of the people in the ecosystem, some of the dark forest people that you've talked to before. If, for example, we've like contributed to the most recent like research organization they created, because
Yeah.
really like some of
Zero
that
X
stuff is
Park.
going to be necessary. Yeah, 0x Park. Some of that
Great
stuff is going to be
name.
really relevant for like the lowest levels, which are like middle layers built on top of, for us to build the best thing here. So it's still to be seen like which layers of the stack we end up focusing on more over time. Right now, we're kind of doing like all layers of the stack except for the lowest levels. And I guess we'll see. It's really like what is needed from us. Like our best case scenario is that more people come in and like are building websites on top of the Gather, and we focus on the middle, or maybe they come and build the middle and we focus more on the top. Like it's really just like, how can we push this forward the best?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you've gotten a full stack system off the ground that has a really solid amount of usage and product market fit, and you're
Yeah.
kind of exploring and iterating on all of these layers, right? Both at the user layer, where you see like what sorts of things people want from the metaverse and what this thing needs to like look and feel like, to the
Yeah.
developer layer, to like how it's actually architected and like where the data is stored, where the game engine is running, like all of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I do think this is actually kind of philosophically one of like the right way to build the lower levels too. It's like you kind of want the lower level of the platform to be informed by like the use cases, and you kind of want to like trickle down the whole way. And so that's why it's actually kind of nice that we have these all these users using it today, and then hopefully we can get different builders building on top of here that will like inform us in different ways.
totally. Yeah, that's a really powerful feedback loop to have going, to be both the users and then use that to inform what the platform underneath looks like.
Yeah.
So how, I guess one of the things we touched on was, I'm curious, like what are the big puzzle pieces here? So the infrastructure and how it's architected as one. Then there's like identity we talked about. Like how do you think about that? What does that mean?
Identity is always the trickiest thing. Yeah, like with everything, very unclear what the end state is. We can hypothesize that, like, for example, some things that will be useful is if you could say, prove that you're over 21 to get into a bar without revealing your birthday, that kind of thing, right? Like the classic zero knowledge proof kind of stuff. And like prove that you have access to a space without revealing your identity or something like that, right? Like this kind of thing seems like the kind of thing that should be possible and requires sort of like a powerful kind of identity that you can use with zero knowledge proofs and stuff like that. At the same time, like people just like have lots of different identities in different systems and stuff like that. And like probably whatever we choose is not going to be, totally sufficient for everything. So a model that you can like log in with X, where like X can be any number of things, is like probably approximately correct, because like different identity systems are better for different things and different use cases. Consistency across different spaces or like experiences and stuff like that, and like how much of your like avatar and items and everything like translate between all of these different spaces is like super inherently tied to identity, but also to like how much cohesion we even expect in like the rest of the ecosystem, right? Like you want it to be the case that people can experiment with different game engines, that the trade-off for that is like maybe this pickaxe that I got in this other space doesn't like have an equivalent rendering in some other game engine world. So like balancing the like cohesion and expressiveness and sort of how much you can change seems like that's going to be a delicate balance.
I think the identity piece like is one of the things that it seems more clear that it shouldn't be a part of Gather, I guess. It's like you really want it to exist outside of Gather, and what exactly is in there hopefully will be determined by the ecosystem as time goes on, in terms of like what do people actually want? Do they actually want their goods attached to it? Do they want their access controls? Do they want like their like what all these things a part of it? And I think it's like what we're kind of waiting for. I mean, I think the way our approach is basically like we're going to have a Gather identity system. We want to make it easy to over like another kind of like third party identity system in the ecosystem comes about. We can like migrate to that. People can like kind of like port over to that, and then hopefully it's not just us deciding like what identity looks like. And I think this is generally like our ethos around developing all of this stuff is like we're building our versions today because like there isn't a version otherwise, but then hopefully other people come in and help define what this looks like, and there's other like alternatives they can use, not just like Gather Chrome. There's also like Gather Internet Explorer, Gather with different browsers, basically.
Yeah, identity is a particularly big one. I totally agree with you, because it comes bundled with ownership, like over everything other person owns, like ownership over their own data, potentially the social graph, right? The relationships
Yeah.
between the different identities is probably kept within this like external or like decentralized identity system. So that's a really important one.
Yeah. I think it is important for it to be the
Yeah.
identity and the social graph to be unified in a very meaningful way, though, because that's kind of when you're thinking about the metaverse, like the unit is like people showing up, and you don't want it to feel stratified across metaverses, right? So like if I'm kind of like in a Gather version, a Gather client of the metaverse, and there's like another client of the metaverse that someone else is in, you kind of want to be able to like text each other or communicate or do like a phone call so that like they could send over a link, whatever that may mean, and like teleport to where you are, right?
Totally. I'm sure you're kind of tracking how identity in the crypto or in the Ethereum world specifically is evolving, but it's been a kind of interesting second order effect of, we all have wallets that we log into these websites with, and our addresses are gradually becoming our identities, right? Where I mean, even what we were talking about early on, where if there's this external, developer server running that checks if you have a particular NFT and lets you enter this room, that room would be all of the people who own that particular NFT. So that is like the identity and the social graph being imported from this external system.
Right. I think another interesting point that people don't think about as much is that like there's definitely also multiple social graphs, even in the world where all these social graphs are decentralized. Like there actually are just like the LinkedIn social graph is just a completely different social graph than your Facebook one, which is really different than, I don't know what people are using nowadays.
And you don't necessarily want them to actually be connected with each other, right?
Yeah.
Like you want, and that's actually, it's a cool area of work. I mean, talking about zero knowledge proofs and whatnot of linking identities to each other or, in zero knowledge ways, like pseudonymity at a core protocol level. I know that this message came from one of these 100 people, like that it for sure came from one of these people, but I don't know which one it did. And that just opens up a whole world of interesting stuff.
Right. And of course, you want to make sure that all these things are private enough too. You don't want to just like everyone to know all your connections and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, like there's a lot of exciting developments in the ecosystem that we're like keeping track of and trying to figure out how we can push it forward.
So to pivot a little bit, one thing I'm curious about is, which I think is a key part of these questions, is business model, right? Because that has effects on what emerges ultimately. So how do you think about that?
Yeah. So first off, given that we're at multiple layers of the stack, it's also like you have different business models at each layer. So for example, or what it looks like today, and we kind of honestly just slapped on a business model in the very beginning because we didn't want to take on VC funding in the beginning. And so like we just kind of slapped one on, started making money, and we haven't like really changed it yet. And actually it's not too bad. Basically people just pay directly for us for the events product. And most of the social use cases today are free under under 25 people in a space at the same time. You can just have for free. And we like this because it's like aligned, right? It's just like people pay for it as much as it gives you value. But over time, I think you need different kind of monetizations for each layer, right? So like while there continues to be a kind of like a remote work app of the metaverse, regular SaaS subscription is probably fine. But once you start thinking about like the platform, then you want that to be aligned in a different way. And there's like multiple things that we've been thinking about here. One could be like a Unity model. So this is like Unity, the game engine. And basically what they say is, it's pretty awesome. They say like, if you're a small developer, Unity is free. And then if you make like more than 100K in revenue, it costs this much. And if you make more than like a million or something in revenue, you pay a higher tier. And I think that's not like pretty aligned, where it's like, to make it basically the more money the creators are making, the more money you make. That's one idea. What we kind of philosophically want is like, we own some amount of equity in an ecosystem. And so, like this is the model that, like Ethereum roughly is, where it's like now you're incentivized to just grow the ecosystem generally. And you got some amount of like compensation for kind of starting it. It's just that what that model represents. But again, there's like so many different kind of business models that can exist. It also could just be like, Cloudflare is kind of like an example of the internet somewhere in the middle of the stack that just pays like normal subscription for people who are like doing a lot of volume. So I think it might look like something like that. It might also look like commerce, right? And so like there's like many different ways you can think
Yeah.
about it. We still haven't figured it out. Like,
Right. Yeah, interesting. The model you were describing where you have tiered, based on how much financial success like a user of the platform is having, and then they pay more. That definitely makes sense to me. It's one way to describe maybe the Ethereum model or the crypto model, right? Of that one's a bit more radical, maybe, where you like the token model is where you kind of you share the ownership of the underlying platform. So you own X% of it, and other people own Y% of it. But then like the value of the whole thing goes up as other people build on top of it, right? So like you have to bake in some way for growth of the platform translating into value capture by this underlying, ownership structure, which like Ethereum, for example, didn't have for a really long time. Like people don't really talk about this, but it didn't have a strong model for that. But with like, for example, EIP 1559, which got merged in a few months ago, now like every Ethereum block results in some amount of ETH being burnt, like taken out of circulation. And so the more usage the platform is getting, the more ETH is being burnt. And when ETH gets burnt, that's good for the ETH price because it's impacting the supply and demand. So that's how globally, like on a global scale, Ethereum, like ETH captures value from the Ethereum, the network being used more.
Oh wait, actually, sorry, maybe this is a new question. How did it not already have the incentives aligned? Like, doesn't ETH just own a bunch of Ethereum? Was it like people were like minting more or something like that, or?
So there is like a key distinction between Ethereum, the network, and Ethereum Foundation, like the organization, right? The entity. And the Ethereum Foundation, played a key role in creating and like spinning up the Ethereum network, right? Like 6 years ago, or however long it's been. But from that point on, it's been one entity amongst many that, and the kind of goal, the strategic through line of the Ethereum Foundation as a goal, as an organization, is this thing we call subtraction, which I really want to talk about on this podcast at some point, which is that unlike, a traditional company that's trying to grow, right? It has a growth primitive baked into it. You want to grow your revenues, you want to grow your headcount, you want to grow your impact. The Ethereum Foundation has a subtraction philosophy, which is it wants to reduce in size and importance and impact. And as long as that reduction is coincident with the network becoming more independent and growing, right? And I think that's been the case to this point, right? Where if you compare the Ethereum of 5 years ago, it was much, much more dependent on the Ethereum Foundation than the Ethereum of today. And if you fast forward 5 years, that's going to be even more the case. And at some point in the future, the goal, at least in my view, is that we get to something like the internet where there is no organization that matters, right? And we're close to that even at this point, right? Like the EF is funding some key research and public goods, and a lot of the ETH2 work and other stuff is being pushed forward by the EF. But so it would have a big detrimental effect on the ecosystem if the EF were to disappear today. But at some point that's becoming less and less the case over time.
So I'm actually curious, is there any way that this, besides it being a core value that is really strong, I love it and I've gained a lot of inspiration from it. Is there any way that's institutionalized within the organization, like the way that's set up?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't speak for the Ethereum Foundation anymore, right? I don't formally work there. I've transitioned out, but I still keep in close contact with the people, and I was there for some time, and I have a ton of respect for the org and the people there. I mean, maybe one answer that comes to mind is even around questions like hiring, right? Like this is something that a lot of people ask, is how many people work at the Ethereum Foundation? It's a pretty, normal expected question to ask, but the answer to it isn't super straightforward, because the EF, whenever the EF wants to make something happen, the model is to try to push it into the ecosystem, right? So it's to find some group that is interested and aligned and capable and like making this happen, or it's somehow aligned with like the vision of the world that they have, and then to empower them to do that. And that's by like giving them grant funding, by, doing all of this stuff. And maybe like 0x Spark is a good example of that, right? Where it's like this group wants to do fundamental, ZKP research and application R&D. And so it's like, great, an independent organization doing that is better for the ecosystem. So, a organization that wasn't set up in this way might think that, oh, like we want the core research to happen in here because we want to like have like we want to own the results of it or whatever. In the case of EF and Ethereum, it's like, no, this is actually what we want. We push it out. And that's why like the EF as an org is quite thin, right? Not too many work in the EF. And the reason is that a lot of the people focus on giving grants, and like it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
It definitely warrants a deep dive at some point.
Yeah, I love it because I feel like we have a lot to learn from the Ethereum Foundation. It's kind of like the first of its kind that intentionally created an ecosystem like this. Like I guess you could also say the open web and the internet kind of was as well, but they had like 20 years to mature before like a ton of people started using them, and there's all these sorts of pressures from different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like your question might have been something along the lines of like, how does this also show up? Because I know we've talked about the subtraction value before. And I think like similarly, like success to us would also look like that we don't need to build at every layer of the stack anymore. In fact, like other people are better than us at building certain layers. Because our view of the metaverse is just like there's so many problems to solve. So like there's no point in trying to like defend which problems like I particularly going to solve. Someone solve another problem, great. Like we'll go work on another one.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked about like institutionalizing this within the organization is it's not any stronger today than just a value that we repeat, that, like collective value is what matters. It's like not about like what we specifically do, but what is the metaverse impacting for humanity generally, right? In the future, I think we could imagine, say, like the metric would be maybe the metric that people start optimizing is not oriented towards, they would be oriented towards the size of like the economy on top of this, not like which part are we capturing, could be one example.
And then there's incentives, right? Like business models, like ultimately, what direction do these types of things lead? Like in the case of the Ethereum Foundation, it's a Swiss nonprofit foundation. And I mean, that's one big thing right there. And then it holds some ETH from the genesis of Ethereum. And so it wants Ethereum as an ecosystem to grow and flourish, right? Like it doesn't have any interest that isn't aligned with Ethereum, the larger network. So I think that's super powerful.
Yeah, actually, I think one thing that is kind of nice is we have benefited from the larger kind of like Web3 culture becoming larger. I think like it's less controversial now to say things like we don't care like how big exactly gathers. We care mostly about how big the metaverse is, because like more people that like already like on board with that.
Totally.
And that's actually another interesting point that isn't related to the gather generally, but it's kind of like some thought around culture matters more exactly than a bit more than the right incentives necessarily. In that like incentives are for corralling a bunch of people who might not have the same worldviews together. When everyone also just has the same worldview, you don't need to matter as much about like what the right incentive models are. And so like maybe that's also how it shows up in the Ethereum Foundations. Like the culture is just set so correct that the decisions actually reflect that. And
because Ethereum's like it is an ecosystem, right? And I think maybe one definition for an ecosystem is that there are multiple distinct cultures, right? Like where they don't even agree necessarily on what this thing is. Right. So if like you could go talk with 5 people from different corners of the Ethereum ecosystem, they would just describe totally different things that are attracting them to this, right? Like someone, a musician who's like come in because they like are excited about NFTs and how that can give them control, ability to like make money from their arts in a different way, to in the DeFi world, like someone who's just stoked on financial engineering, to someone who's, living in a country with high inflation and wants to like escape that. And like, there's just so many different things. Like one analogy I've always liked is the blind men touching the elephant and trying to figure out what it is. And I think maybe that's one descriptor of a thing that's become truly decentralized, or a true ecosystem where you can't really describe what it is anymore, right? There are like fundamentally different ways to see it.
Right. Like the same
I
thing
don't
with
know.
the internet.
I'm
right?
also just riffing here. So
no, I think it's true. Like you go back and you watch videos of like Bill Gates trying to describe the internet on like a talk show, and he's trying to describe, oh, you can like kind of beam information however you want, and they're like, well, have you heard of like physical mail? And it's like, oh no, but you can like listen to like a sports game like real time. It's like, well, isn't that just radio? And it's like there's a really hard like disconnect to exactly describe what it was. Obviously now we all know what it is, right?
Yeah.
But even then, like I think if you ask your generic person who uses the internet, they wouldn't be able to describe like exactly what it means.
Yeah, there's no one way to describe the internet.
Yeah. I think the metaverse is still very early, but I feel like eventually it'll end up like that. Like already, for example, whenever we talk about recruiting, and sometimes people ask me like, oh, what should the pitch be? And usually I'm just like, well, there's like 1,000 different use cases and 1,000 different reasons to be excited about the metaverse. So you should just pick the one that you're most excited about and just say that one. Because like, it's also going to work a lot better. People are going to understand that it's like genuine.
Totally. So maybe one thing I wanted to talk about was, there's a good version of this when we're talking about the metaverse, right? There's a good version of this future, and there's a potentially less good version of it, right? When it comes to decentralization, ownership, like I know you guys are thinking about these sorts of things. And I wonder, is there a path dependence to how all of this develops from here? Like, could we end up in different futures, or is it pretty clear that it's going to shake out in one way?
Yeah, definitely not clear. Me and Nate were talking about this for like hours last night about path dependencies. I think, okay, so when we say dystopian kind of future of the metaverse, I think there's multiple ways people are thinking about it. I can talk about the ones that are like not centralization first. Like, I think a lot of people also think about like, is this a world where I will never see people in person ever again? I'm strapped into a VR headset all day. And I think that one is really more so like, again, to the vision of the metaverse will integrate a lot more with like real life, right? And it's not here to like replace all interaction. That's not the point. The point is to use it for people you can't normally see. I mean, that's actually like a huge improvement over status quo for like a lot of contexts. I think the other one is like the fear of like it being owned too much by any one company, right? And like what you see today with some certain like platforms is that they make policies and they're like not exactly kind of like accountable to anyone, right? It's like they might be a platform that has all rule over like 3 billion people, and none of those people like really feel like they had any say.
We can name names. It's fine.
Oh,
where this is being recorded the day after the Facebook and Meta talk, right? Like the announcement.
Yeah, I didn't actually mean to like throw shade on Facebook in particular. Actually, like my personal stance, it's really hard for them to have known that much better. Like, it's only been 15 years since they like really like started or so. And it's really hard for them to understand like how it would have turned out, like, all the things that would have happened.
That is insane that Facebook started 15, however many years ago. That it's crazy the rate at which these things can grow.
Exactly. And now they're at a point where it's hard for them to make massive changes too. Right. And so I see it more as like, we can learn from what we've seen so far. And yeah, I guess with that, I think it is something important to point out is that like a lot of people are really excited for all what decentralized systems could do, but it's not like a given that they'll win either. I think a great example is like the internet came before phones, and yet like phones weren't architected in a way, like apps are kind of very siloed. And so you do have a lot of
Totally.
path dependence. You kind of need to like build a network effect across like a decentralized system so that when it comes time for other players to say Facebook, who maybe owns the whole stack from hardware down to the apps store to the apps themselves, it makes more sense for them to be a part of the decentralized system rather than like kind of like build their own siloed thing. For what it's worth, actually, though, like it seems like a lot of the big messaging that Facebook is trying to say nowadays is that they really believe in interoperability and openness. It's unclear. This is what me and Nate were talking about last night. It's unclear exactly what that means to them. And I think
Yeah.
the choice of their name actually really exemplifies that, where like naming themselves Meta is kind of a way to like make metaverse synonymous with Facebook, which is like totally different than the Ethereum way of thinking about things, as we talked about, right? Where it's like you kind of explicitly don't want to be a big deal. You don't want to be the whole point.
Yeah.
So yeah, so like I think really just to wrap it up, it's really just like you need to start building these decentralized systems and build network effects across them and get enough people on them fast enough so that like everyone else, it will make sense for them to join onto that decentralized network.
It's so interesting, this whole Facebook meta thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that like also I mean, I was talking with some people earlier today about how on the one hand, I have kind of deep respect for them for just putting a flag in the ground, like showing this much conviction and vision for a company of that size.
Yeah.
And it's really badass in
You've
a certain
you've
way.
never seen like a $1 trillion company pivot like this. It's actually
Right.
pretty insane to see.
Yeah, and it has this focus in it. And I mean, I'm sure it's been a rallying cry for people who are working at Facebook and or Meta or and whatever. But on the other hand, I mean, it's also like quite worrying that they're going down this path. And part of me wants to like believe that they're going to build a good version of this world, but then part of me also thinks that like actions speak louder than words, and you can
Mhm.
kind of look at historically like what they've done and the business models that are like defining their
Totally.
company. And yeah, I mean, what do they mean by we want
Mm.
this thing to be open and interoperable?
Yeah. I've been trying to understand that myself. I've been reading all the interviews. I think really the only thing we can do is just build and build faster. And like to go back to the mobile example, there's some amount of win there where like all phones felt forced to put a browser on their phone. Right. So there was some connection to the open internet. And so hopefully we can at least get that. Hopefully we can get something further where it's like it becomes clear to everyone else that they're better off coming onto this platform.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal outcome is like there exists a platform that's sort of like expressive and interconnected enough that like Facebook rationally wants to like be part of that metaverse, and like they add to it, right? Like by Facebook joining that metaverse, like whatever Facebook builds gets better and that metaverse itself gets better. Um, and so like, I don't know, the challenge of the next couple of years is like to make everyone, to find a system where like everyone gains more from contributing to it than from doing their own thing. Like, regardless of Facebook, that's like a correct property of any ecosystem. Like this, whatever metaverse
Right.
ecosystem we come up with should accelerate people, not like force them to, use this system because you're not allowed to put other app stores on your device or something.
Right. Has this whole thing kind of impacted your thinking about your strategy or how you're approaching things?
Um, it's in progress. Like as we mentioned, this it happened yesterday. Me and Nate talked about it last night. I mean, our values definitely remain the same. Now the question is like, do we try to make the underlying like decentralized
Yeah.
network even faster? And we're still trying to figure out like what could we actually do to help contribute to that.
It makes me think of, I think it was this article that Balaji wrote about India and Bitcoin, and where he was making the case that, there are two kind of poles of power in the world, being like the US and China, and they're each kind of trying to gain
Mm,
adoption of their currency as the world currency, right? Like there's USD and there's the Chinese yuan, and
mm,
India kind of has this. He was making the case that India could strategically like adopt Bitcoin, and Bitcoin could become the third alternative that is not owned by either of these two countries. It's like the third independent, like decentralized currency for the world, or the store of value for the world. And I feel like there could be something to that tune here around the metaverse, quote unquote, where there's like the Facebook metaverse, and this acts as a catalyst for everyone else to build the decentralized metaverse as an alternative.
Oh, that's actually kind of interesting. It's like, as long as there's like 3+ players in the space that are all equally sized, like a decentralized network is going to make sense because it allows two of them to collaborate.
Right.
And now like that is bigger, and now everyone's like incentivized to be a part of it.
Well, we'll see if that ends up happening. Facebook is still buying up all the VR studios, so.
Yeah, but on the other hand, like Apple and Microsoft and Snapchat, they're all talking about the metaverse now too, or not talking about it. They're like basically talking about it, as are like many other larger companies, so, and medium-sized companies.
Yeah,
and Gather. So
yeah, how do you feel about the word metaverse? Because this was another thing that people were talking about on Twitter yesterday.
I know. I mean, actually that's another way it shows up too. Is like if everyone now wants to use a different term because Facebook is now called Meta, like that's just another example of how like everyone else jumps over to this new term, and then that's like the equivalent to now Facebook needs to also kind of do it too. Actually, another thing we were throwing around last night, and curious to get your thoughts on it, was like the Ethereum community is also very large. Like, what percentage of those people would channel energy into the metaverse if given the right starting tools and abstractions and ideas of like what is missing? You know, like maybe it's not clear to people what they could do to push forward the future of the metaverse.
Oh, I think it's a huge focus for people. Like there are like mad tweet storms flying around last night. Twitter was popping off.
Energy.
Yeah, good energy. Yeah, I mean, I actually discovered a couple of Twitter accounts that I hadn't been following who had really thoughtful takes, like to the tune of like things I was saying of like, there is this path dependency, like, you know, now there is a timeline and we need to move on this. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the building blocks are there, right? Like the identity piece is there, the decentralized network is there, the decentralized storage is there, like ZKPs are there. At some level of zooming in, you could call all of like crypto like the metaverse, right? Like I guess you could call it a virtual like world that you can walk around in. But if you kind of open the definition up to interactions with each other, right? Like DAOs, NFTs, like all of this stuff is a part of the metaverse. So I do wonder how all of this is going to evolve. I feel like it's probably going to be more and more of a focal point of for the larger community to kind of collaborate and build with each other. And I mean, I think like given your alignment with this philosophy and how you're thinking about Gather, and like I think there's so many, like Gather's like perfect for this world, right? Like the other day I wrote, and we kind of had a quick back and forth around how cool Gather spaces could be for DAOs, like very soon. Like I guess as soon as you have the API that someone can plug into and just check that someone holds a particular token, you could literally have a space similar to a token gated Discord. You could have a Gather space that DAO members can come into at all hours of the day. And all of a sudden you give this community that to this point has been kind of disembodied, it's just been usernames in the chat group. Now they can actually like hang out with each other. And I feel like that alone would be a huge thing.
Yeah. Well, we're very excited to just like work with the broader community on what this might look like, on how we can all push for this feature more. And like how do we get to the right metaverse, basically?
Totally. On a lighter note, I saw that you had a pudgy penguin in your office.
Yes, this is part of our way of kind of trying to like culturally making it more prominent, like thinking more about the Web3 stuff because it's just going to be so important. And so, we bought a pudgy penguin, we put it in our office. What we might do for some of like our holiday gift, and I hope this comes out after we give it to people so that no one's watching and like learning the secret. We might like try to give NFTs that people can like put on their desks or something like that. We haven't decided exactly what.
Cool.
But yeah, like I think people have been asking this for a long time. Is like, can we put our NFTs in our space? Someone actually prototyped that internally, and then we're like, well, actually, the bright version is like allow someone to have built that and not like
Totally.
Build it in ourselves. And so
Totally.
that's what Nate's working on now.
I wonder when you guys are ready with your APIs and whatnot, like just coming into some like crypto hackathons, like ETH Global events and whatnot. I feel like that could be a really cool way to get the community jamming on this stuff.
Oh, totally. We'll definitely try to figure out how to do all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll have the hackathon itself in Gather, and if people can hack in the Gather space, they're already hacking. Like everyone's sitting in that space, and all of a sudden, like a monster pops out because someone programmed that, or like all of a sudden, like an impromptu Among Us game, and everyone's like all of a sudden a character in this game. Anyway, we have a lot of fun with it. There's so many ideas. We're really excited to just like interface more with the Web3 community, and I think it's going to be so important for building the right metaverse here. And so check out Gather, drop us a line if you have any interesting ideas or collaborations or anything of the sort.
What's the best way for people to start riffing on this stuff?
We can put a link to the WebSocket API docs in the description. Yeah, or like a link to the community Discord or forum or something like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like joining the community, and like maybe there's a Web3 corner of it where people can start riffing on these ideas. I'll definitely participate in that.
Well, thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.